Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Offshore Diaries. This is Paulo Santos, one of your hosts here. Today, we have a special guest, Alka Bahal from OGC Solutions, who is actually an immigration attorney for corporations. And obviously, in the offshoring industry, there's a lot of this stuff that happens that companies are bringing people over. There's all sorts of visas, all stuff that I'm certainly not qualified to talk about. Alka, can you tell us a bit about your background and the things you do for these corporations?
Absolutely. Thank you, Paulo. So I've been a corporate immigration attorney for, almost 30 years now. And I do all things related to employment as they relate to immigration. So assisting U.S. employers with bringing foreign nationals, keeping those foreign nationals in the long run, and of course with the multinational companies that have entities in the U.S. and abroad, moving their employees back and forth as necessary. So I have a lot of experience in this area.
Very cool. Very cool. So I'm going to start off right out the bat, swinging here. First thought in your head when I ask, should companies be focusing on bringing remote workers that are currently remote? Is there a benefit to them to bring them in-house here?
I think under the current environment, especially, employers should think very carefully. In my experience, the real benefit to having offshore remote workers is the cost savings. You can account for all the issues like time difference and those, language barriers. You can train for those things. But if you bring an employee to the U.S. in a visa capacity, and we'll talk a little bit later about what are those potential visas, because they're quite limited, you're ending up having to, adhere to U.S. regulations. So you have obligations with wages, you have obligations with medical insurance, all kinds of additional things that are going to attach because of the employment occurring in the United States. Whereas if the employee is situated in a foreign country, then the employment regulations of the foreign country attach, which are probably beneficial in a remote employment situation.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I say the same thing to a lot of my clients and a lot of my business colleagues. You're hiring overseas for a reason. Otherwise, you would have hired here. There has to be something beneficial for you that you're doing it, and most of that is cost reduction.
Correct.
Why remove that out of the equation just to have them physically in-house, right? So let's talk about that. You did mention different kinds of visas and things people can come here to the United States on. Can you walk me through some of those examples?
Of course. So with a multinational company, one of the unique visas that's available to them is called an international or intra-company transferee. This does have some restrictions, though. In order for the employee to qualify, they have to either be employed in a managerial, executive, or a specialized knowledge capacity. And that specialized knowledge has to relate to the entity abroad than the entity to the U.S. There's some other requirements, but those are sort of the key element is the position itself. So it's really, again, for professional or higher level roles. Beyond that, a common visa, I think, for this situation would be the J1, where an individual could come for a limited period of time. And the real purpose of the J1 visa, which is an exchange visitor visa, is an exchange not only of information in terms of providing some additional training or having them come as an intern, but also the cultural competence, right? It gives you an exchange of ideas where the foreign national is coming, contributing their culture to the company, as well as the company providing some cultural elements for the employee to learn about the American culture. So to the extent you have remote workers and they're supporting a U.S. company, I think a limited duration of cultural training probably wouldn't be a bad thing.
Right. Now, what's that normal time frame that the exchange takes place? Is it 6 months? Is it a year?
So there are different categories where you can bring a J1 over. Here, I think the common ones would be either as an intern, a trainee, or if they're in school or they're coming over as students, there's some other categories. But the trainee, I think, is probably the most common one, and that is available for a maximum duration of 18 months.
Extendable, or that's 18 months?
That's it, okay. Period. 18 months unless you go away, stay abroad for, I think, a minimum of a year, but it might be 18 months, and then you can reapply again. Okay. And there's another sort of price to pay with the J1. Some J1s carry something called a home residency requirement, which means in exchange for accepting that J1 and being able to come to the U.S. for that particular period, you agree to go home to your home country and serve, expand your services, what you've learned in the home country for a minimum of 2 years before you can come back to the US in any other visa capacity. And that attachment means you can't change off the J1 visa to another type. So
That's
for
a
example,
US regulation?
that's a US
US
regulation.
regulation. Okay.
J1, yeah. And that will attach if the individual is performing functions that fall on something called the skills list. So the Department of State issues periodically a list which say these following skills are in shortage in certain countries.
Wow.
And if your category falls into the list, then you're subject to it. If the government has participated in any way providing funding for your education, or for the J1 program, then the home residency requirement will attach.
Okay. First of all, we're going to add that URL for that skills list because I think that's really cool for our
Definitely.
audience to be looking at. If your employer is trying to bring you, or if you want to try to come over, start learning some of these skills. that's one of them. Is start educating yourself. Okay, so the company has a remote employee now. Let's focus on the J1s, not the multinational companies, because I think that's a much smaller group of people,
Cool.
especially in our audience. You have a remote worker in the Philippines, for example. Company likes you. They say, you know what? Let's get you here. Let's go with the J1 route first as an intern or cultural exchange. Let's get you here to train, right? Before we have any more expansion of that conversation, is there any risk on that remote worker's side? Any reason why they shouldn't come here that you can think of the top of your head?
The only risk comes into play in terms of, are you qualified? Are you going to have a good application? And could you be turned down at the consulate? So there's always like a risk of not getting the visa that you're looking for, but I don't think that is anything that provides any long-term damage. You can always try and reapply again. So in that sense, no, I don't think so necessarily any specific risk.
And that's the U.S. consulate in their home country, in the foreign country.
You got it. Yes.
They have to approve. They have to have an application and an interview process with them, right?
That is correct.
Why they're coming here, how long, what kind of visa, all that good stuff.
Yes. So with a J1, it's a pretty formal process. So technically speaking, with a J1 visa, there are certain entities in the US that are designated as what we call J1 sponsors. So these are organizations that have been vetted by the Department of State, and they kind of run these formalized training programs. So you have to go through a J1 sponsor who will charge you fees for their processing, give them the training plan. You arrange for the host and for which is the company, and the trainee. Both have to meet with the program vendor. They have to vet everybody. They have to make sure it's a legitimate business, make sure it's a legitimate job offer, right? They're kind of like a pre-clearinghouse, if you will. If all lines up, they issue the documents that support the training. It's called a DS 2019 form. So once you've cleared their process, this is then provided to the beneficiary or the trainee. They take that to the Department of State, to the consulate, and that's what is used to apply for the visa.
All that, by the way, for an 18-month
Correct.
cultural exchange. Okay.
Yes.
Do you know what those costs usually look like, by the way?
It depends on the category, and it depends on the J1 agency that you use. So there are a number of different categories, and different agencies are authorized to issue certifications in different categories. But for 18 months, I'm thinking it's probably going to run in the neighborhood of $3,000. That fees that come into the.
Yeah, it's money. It's money.
Yeah.
There's definitely an expense there. Okay, so the Filipino decides to go through this process. Their company gets through the process. They get accepted. Everything goes through. The interview process goes clean. They get here. They start working. First question I'll have with that scenario is, are they paid a U.S. wage?
Absolutely.
They have to be paid a U.S. wage at this point, even at that J1 level, because they're doing the work here.
In the U.S. Okay. They are subject to all federal and state wage and hour laws.
Companies listen to this, by the way. You have somebody working at a much lower wage than what the U.S. minimum wage is. What's the value again of bringing them over here, even for 18 months? Does that equate to the expense you're going to have to take on, including the J1 sponsorship fees and everything else and those things. Okay. So the VA is here working, getting paid a US minimum wage. This brings up a story in my head of a client that I have that I literally did exactly this. They brought 2 Filipino remote workers that they liked, brought them here on J1s. After a period of time, surprise, surprise, just before their visas expiring, disappear. From what I understand, they left the company and were looking to marry somebody else in the US. Okay. The company has put in this much time, this much money into you, expecting that you would go back for a cultural exchange, back to your home country and expand your service and work deeper within the company. They no longer are findable by the company. Does the company have any legal avenue to go after them? What could they actually go after? Is the company liable for anything as well? Right? What's the repercussions of something like that happening? Let's talk about the company side of things first.
Yeah, those are some really great questions and a really well-known risk. You really do have to be aware that when you are bringing foreign nationals over who are not permanent long-time employees, who may not be invested in you as much as you're invested in them, that is a risk. And we know from the current political climate that there is a very decent number of foreign nationals that are now unlawfully present in the U.S. because they've come in on visas and overstayed them. And the J's are, one of those categories that could be a problem. What I would say is under the current regulations, there is no specific rule that says you as a host company employer are responsible for this individual. However, you do agree to certain reporting requirements and you have to report back on a regular basis, I think it's weekly, to the J sponsoring agency about what's going on with the employee. So there is a responsibility to immediately notify the J agency if the employee has disappeared. I think that there is a larger onus on the J1 sponsoring agency if the employee does up and disappear, because one of their responsibilities is to vet to make sure the employee is going to adhere to the requirements of the visa, which include going home at the end of it. So if they failed in that, they could then have repercussions. But I think it's limited on the host company other than just making sure they've notified correctly.
Well, I would also assume another risk in that scenario is that the company, that's the sponsoring company bringing them over, and the consulate in the Philippines or whatever country is going to look at this company as a bit of a risk as well. Like, why are we going to continue approving people for you if you've had people jump ship in the past?
Absolutely. It's definitely a ding on the company's sort of record, if you will.
Right.
And if it happens once, maybe, but if it's happened the third time, I think that company can pretty much be guaranteed they're not going to get any more visas in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So you brought up the current administration. In what you're seeing, how has that affected, the companies that have people here or are trying to get people? Is it getting more difficult? Is the process getting longer, more expensive? How is that affecting the current, with the current administration, how's that affecting this bringing people over immigration situation?
Yes, yes, and yes. So yes, everything is getting more difficult. Things are taking longer. There are an increased number of denials happening at the consulate, much more aggressive posturing and enforcement across the board. So, another compounding factor, which isn't probably visible to the public, is because of the way the administration is internally handling things in the federal government, and maybe a lot of individuals who are long-term Department of Homeland Security employees don't agree with the policies that are being implemented currently, they've left. And so this has caused sort of a gap in experience and knowledge across immigration services from the Department of State to USCIS. And so we have a younger workforce, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but also more limited in experience and knowledge and training. And so that is slowing down processing. It's increasing the number of questions when they don't really understand something that's complicated. It is causing them, in my opinion, to miss certain things that are in the application because of a nuance that they don't understand. For example, I've had some folks who have applied for kind of the regular standard work visas, either an H-1B or an L-1B, which is the intercompany transferee at a consulate abroad. And then they've been asked the same set of questions, including things like, what is your itinerary? Who is sponsoring your conference? Questions that don't relate to this visa type. They are for business visa. They're not part of this. And they're just getting this standard list of questions. And then they don't know how to answer because it doesn't relate to their visa. So that's an example of how, and then it becomes quite frustrating for them trying to go through their interview process to get their visa. It creates this complication. So we're seeing that across the board. And then to your point about, is there any responsibility by the host company? I mean, those are things where, we're seeing this very aggressive stance, right? We're now seeing immigration has been focused on finding and deporting, right, illegal individuals. Now the focus is moving more to employers. Are you an employer who employs somebody who's unauthorized? So I do think that the trend of focusing on the employers, if you're luring, quote unquote, the foreign nationals here, and then quote unquote allowing them to stay in the workforce illegally, and then it's going to be the host companies or the employer's responsibility for those bad activities. We're not there yet, but that's the trend where I see where we're moving.
That's frightening. I'll warn my client ahead of time, just
please.
So administration definitely cracking down on immigration.
Yeah.
Because of that, is there today a legitimate path to actually become naturalized and get citizenship in this country through one of these types of visas now? And is it a realistic path that's not gonna, that's costly and within a time constraint? Is it really realistic right now? Or is it just way too difficult?
Absolutely. It can still happen. No, it can still happen for sure. But you have to remember that the U.S. immigration scheme is focused more on professionals. So we have a number of different ways. A professional individual can be sponsored for a position, come here on a non-immigrant visa, get a permanent residency. It can be very lengthy depending on what country you were born in, because especially with the green cards, the way we divide up, so we issue a limited number of green cards annually, right? That's reasonable. We divide that up equally among all the countries in the world. So those countries that tend to send us more individuals tend to have a longer line, and there are certainly more applications every year than there are visas available. So for example, Sweden sends us 25 people and India sends us 500,000. You end up with this sort of dichotomy, and there's no line for Sweden, but there's a long line if you're
right.
And that could be 10, 15 years just to get your green
card.
Years.
Wow. Okay, but you also mentioned that skill set again. Like you're looking for skilled professionals. So if I'm talking about remote workers on the virtual assistant side, you better be doing something so unique that's on that list, and that you can prove, and your employer can prove that you've done it for a period of time, that we need those skill sets here in the United States. That sounds very difficult.
I think you've misunderstood the skills list.
Okay.
So the skills list indicates the skills that are deemed to be in shortage in the home country. So for example, if the skills list says there's not enough marketing professionals in the Philippines, and you're coming to the US to do some advanced training in marketing because we want to understand how it works in the American market versus the Filipino market, that's going to make you subject to the 2-year home residency, because we want you to now take that knowledge you've learned and use it in the Philippines.
Right. But why does the U.S. care if we bring it back to the Philippines or not? Like, what does the U.S. benefit of us learning here just to bring it back outside of their country?
I think it's just purely an issue of negotiation between two countries.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Cool. Anything else from the risk side of this process that you think we should bring up?
The only thing I would say is, if you do want to move people internationally right now, think carefully before you do it. Don't leap and then look, and get the advice of qualified immigration attorney before you make any moves. So at least you know what you're getting into. A lot of this is a matter of risk versus reward. What is your risk tolerance? But I'm always a proponent of the fact that it's better to know what your risks and your liabilities are before you jump in. You still want to jump in, that's fine, but you should know what they are.
Yes. qualified professionals like Alka. I can vouch for her work myself personally. Alka, thank you so much. This has been really informative, a lot of fun, and really opened up a lot of questions I think that our listeners are going to have. And quite frankly, employers and companies need to listen to this, because I don't, from the ones that I know, aside from the multinational, very large companies that have in-house counsels that are working with this, a lot of these smaller businesses that are trying to do this are doing this completely blind, trusting that they have a sponsorship company that's going to take care of everything, and they think they're good to go. And there's obviously a lot of issues that we're talking about here. And considering the current administrative and immigration environment in this country, it's not trending well.
Correct.
As far as reducing risks, everything is just increasing right now. Make
agree.
sure you guys have your ducks in a row. Everything is in order. Do not take the risk of whatever else might happen and the consequences along the way. Alka, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. Guys, another episode in the books. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Great. Thank you for having me.